want to present what happened in 2020.
Yes, thank you very much, and good day to everybody. So we've now got full year data for 2020, and let me show you what happened through the year on domestic and international markets for passenger kilometres flown. So overall, global passenger kilometres flown were down 2/3. This is the biggest shock that the industry and air travel has ever experienced. And indeed, international air travel, as you can see, was down much more than the total. It was down 75% for the year as a whole. April was the low point, and in April, we really saw air travel globally at only about 5% of its normal levels, an extraordinarily low level. We saw some recovery during the summer months, particularly on domestic markets, less so on international. But even on those domestic markets, as you can see, by the time we got to the fourth quarter, that recovery had stalled. And we ended up the year in December with global passenger kilometres still down 70% on the year. And in fact, international were down 85%. So we're beginning 2021, which we still expect to be a year of recovery, but from a very low point. Now, I think there were some important lessons that we can draw from the experience of 2020 and the numbers that have been released today. I mean, firstly, on domestic markets, I think we have seen that there is a demand to fly. If consumers, if passengers are able to, if they're not restricted by government travel restrictions, and indeed I think that's shown quite clearly by the domestic markets of China and Russia, which are near to full recovery. And the contrast with Australia, where there were state-level restrictions for much of the year, and we've really only seen signs of life very late last year. Overall load factors for airlines on those domestic markets have recovered reasonably well. By December, overall on domestic markets, load factors were around about 64%. On those Chinese and Russian markets, they were above 70%. So that's not a bad situation for the airlines on those particular markets. But internationally, it's been nothing short, really, of a disaster. We've seen very little recovery from that low point in April for the majority of markets. Where we did see some recovery, it was where travel restrictions were lowered. So, for instance, within Europe, we saw the bubble, the travel corridors established in the summer, leading to a very significant recovery in the summer, before that was completely reversed by the second wave. In Central America and some South American economies, governments have replaced the quarantine requirement with a testing requirement. And as you can see, that has led, certainly on the North America to Central America market, to a significant recovery, although that's quite a small market. But it does show that what's holding back travel are the restrictions that are being imposed, obviously driven by COVID. Vaccines, of course, mean that the second half of this year could be very much better than where we're starting this year, which is at a very depressed place. And I mean, if we look at the medical specialist projections for the timing of herd immunity, and also the timing of when the vulnerable and healthcare populations will be vaccinated for a number of key countries. You can see here in this chart, really this is the basis of our December forecast for a strong second half recovery in air travel, at least in the advanced markets. As you can see, even in December, we were expecting that in many of the emerging markets, it would take very much longer to roll out the vaccine. It would take very much longer for international travel restrictions to come down on many of those markets. So it would only be a partial, a multi-speed recovery. But of course, the new factor, since we made these forecasts in December, and since these medical forecasts were made in December, is the emergence of the new variants and the uncertainty that has created in whether these herd immunity projections are still valid, whether or not it might take longer to protect the population against some, at least, of these new variants. We just don't know for certain at this stage. And the additional uncertainty that's being created by that is also how governments are reacting to this situation, because governments have been very risk averse in opening borders and reducing travel restrictions, and that's even more so. But I think the second positive point I would make is that, alongside with the domestic recoveries in travel that we've seen, I think there's also evidence of pent-up demand for leisure travel and also VFR, visiting friends and relatives travel. Whenever governments have relaxed travel restrictions, in this case, the UK government exempting the UAE from quarantine rules in mid-November, whenever those travel restrictions are reduced, bookings from travellers surge. And we saw, pretty much a doubling of bookings in the weeks after that. And we've seen this in other examples, other cases. There's a very large pent-up demand. There's clear evidence of pent-up demand to travel. And that's another basis for that expectation that, once travel restrictions come down, we will see a strong recovery. But I think the other point to draw from this chart is that demand is also very fragile and it's vulnerable to shocks. We saw, as the new variant emerged in the UK at the end of last year, those bookings falling off sharply. And indeed, I think the main point to make, I think, in this presentation as to the path of travel from those 2020 figures into 2021 is what we've seen happening to the new cases of coronavirus in the first weeks of this year. Following those second and third waves in the US and Europe, we've actually seen a rise in coronavirus cases across the world in January, those first few weeks, partly I think driven by the emergence of these new variants. So the control of the virus has become much more difficult. And as a result, we're seeing travel restrictions even tighter. Borders effectively closed to international travel in many cases. This chart here shows a measure of travel restrictions. And as you can see, we'd seen those travel restrictions being eased in all regions from the summer months really through to December. And that's now reversing. And we're now seeing those travel restrictions tighten across the board. So it's no surprise if we look at the bookings data and these measure bookings on these particular dates for future travel. We saw that improving steadily through to really the December holiday period. But since then, since the emergence of the new variants, the rise in coronavirus cases, the tightening of travel restrictions, we've seen bookings fall very sharply. Towards the end of last year, we saw bookings improve to a point where they were about 60% down on a year earlier. That's now deteriorated to a point of perhaps 70% down. So I think, clearly the near-term outlook is very much darker than we had expected. It's going to be a very tough start to the year, as many airlines are already reporting. And if we look at the path of passenger kilometres flown globally in this chart here, the blue line shows the historic data, and as you can see, the summer recovery stalled at the end of last year. The red lines show our projections. The solid red line is our December forecast. So as you can see from that, even in December, we were expecting a pretty tough first half of this year before the vaccinations of vulnerable groups allowed governments to reduce travel restrictions, and then that pent-up demand that we have evidence for led to, we're expecting, we hope, that will lead to a sharp recovery in the second half of this year. But even if the fourth quarter looks relatively good, the weak start to the year means that even on that December forecast, we would expect that the average growth over the year was just 50%, and actually the average level is perhaps half of what we were flying in 2019. And at the moment, that is looking really the best that we could expect to achieve, because we think the risks have really swung to the downside because of the new variants, because of what we've seen in the very risk-averse approach of governments in terms of reducing travel restrictions. So the dotted line shows our expectation for the path for RPKs should the new variants prove difficult to deal with the existing vaccines, and should governments take a much more cautious approach than we had been expecting. If that's the case, and this is a risk scenario, because the uncertainties about what happens in the second half are still very high, but if it does prove that the vaccines are not as effective against the new variants, and governments take a much more cautious approach to relaxing travel restrictions, then we could be seeing a rise which would only average about 13% and take the average level in 2021 of passenger kilometres flown to an average level across the year of about 38% of 2019 levels. And I will leave it there and hand back to Tony. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. Just to be clear on that last point, we are not revising our forecast, is that correct? This is only an introduction of what might happen, or looking at what might happen.
That's correct, yes. But certainly the risks have risen, that we're moving away from that solid line towards that dotted line. But we just don't have enough information as yet to know with a greater degree of certainty what the second half might look like.
Great, excellent. Thanks very much, Brian. With that, I'll now turn it over to Alexandre de Juniac for a few comments before we take questions.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Brian. And thank you to all for joining this briefing. I have just a few comments to share before we take your questions. Brian's presentation clearly shows the severe situation of the global air transport industry. The first, international passenger demand was down by 75%, domestic demand by nearly half. Second, air cargo fared better, with the decline limited to 10%. That is making it a revenue lifeline for many airlines and routes. But third, the overall point to make on 2020 is that it saw the biggest fall in demand ever, and any recovery stalled in November. Our forecast is for traffic to return to half of 2019 levels in 2021. But the proliferation of restrictions on travel that we have seen since the beginning of the year could make even that modest outlook very challenging. Brian's variant scenario demonstrates how the downside risk to the forecast could limit the recovery to 38% of 2019 levels. That would make a tough year even tougher. In the face of these new restrictions, our call for a partnership with governments is even more essential. There will be a turning point in this crisis, and it's important to be prepared for it. I don't think that anyone foresees the world free from COVID-19 anytime soon. Certainly not in the next month or even within this year. But our ability to manage the risk is increasing as more people get vaccinated and testing capacity expands. Eventually, we will be at a point where these and other measures give governments the reassurance that the risk of restarting our lives, including travel, is tolerable, recognizing also the significant social and economic benefits that are at stake. We are eager to work with governments as partners to understand what the benchmarks and conditions will be for a decision to give people back their freedom of movement. Why are we so eager for a plan? So that we don't lose a minute in reconnecting the world when it's safe to do so. A functioning aviation industry will add vital momentum to the economic recovery. Indeed, without aviation, a recovery is likely not possible. We have all seen far too many stories of the terrible job losses and human suffering across the travel and tourism sector. So-called staycations and local tourism are not the answer. Only aviation will be able to energize a recovery. Some governments have already responded positively to a partnership with industry. In the UK, for example, we are working with a local airline association to provide a recommended framework. And this was at the invitation of the government, a very positive sign that the approach of partnership will deliver significant value. In the US, IATA represents the international airlines, the Biden administration's almost daily interagency consultations on COVID measures. And in Latin America, today we will announce an agreement with the government of Panama and Copa Airlines to partner with us in trialing the IATA Travel Pass. This marks the first airline in the Americas to join the program and the first government worldwide. The trial is set to commence in March on selected flights on Copa from the carrier's hub in Panama City. In the meantime, airlines remain in a struggle for survival. In the last days, we have seen thousands of airline staff in the US receive the difficult news that their jobs could disappear on 1st of April, when the current wage subsidy ends. Relief packages have been a vital lifeline for airlines around the world. Governments have stepped up with $200 billion to help keep the industry viable. But even this staggering amount will not see the industry through if we have severe travel restriction well into 2021. More will be needed. There is no single formula for the aid that is needed. But what is critically important is that governments understand the specific situation of the airlines in their market and provide the appropriate support. Support that does not increase already high debt levels. And this message also goes out to regional funding mechanisms in the developing world, where governments don't have the resources. International funding organizations such as development banks may need to step in. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Alexandre. Just before we take questions, it occurs to me that we've got a couple sets of numbers floating around. And maybe, Brian, I could just ask you to clarify the difference between the full year 2020-2019 comparison and where we were in December 2020 versus December 2019, just so that we're all clear on where those numbers are.
Yes, sure. So for the recall, we really saw air travel fall off the cliff it was late February, March. So the start of the year was relatively strong. So that affects the year average figures. For the year as a whole, global RPKs, passenger kilometres flown, were down just under 66%. By December, and then they fell to a point in April, a very low point in April. December, they had got to a point where they were just under 70% down on a year earlier.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian. We have we'll go into the questions now. We have one questioner who's asking about testing programs, and particularly airlines that might only allow passengers on board who have been tested. And the question is, do we think that that is a good idea? Alexandre, maybe that one's for you.
We have strongly advocated in favor of systematic testing now for 4 or 5 months, starting in September, because we think that it's a good way to limit the risk of transmitting the virus through air travel under a limit that maintains the pandemic under control. So having people being tested, we think, is a good solution. Combined with the vaccine, it's even a better solution. But now imposing that people are tested is probably more a government decision than an airline decision. But we think that it could contribute, to reduce significantly and to an acceptable level the risk of re-importing or having the virus cross borders and reinfecting some countries.
Thanks very much, Alexandre. We have another question on passenger behavior. And the question is basically, we've been in this crisis now for a year. We see very depressed levels of air travel. Do we think that's becoming habitual? In other words, do we think that this will signal long-term change in passenger behavior? Or I guess the alternative is, do we think that once the restrictions are lifted, we will see a return to previous behavior?
I think we've seen very strong signs of pent-up demand. I think we've seen whenever travel restrictions have been brought down. There was that UK UAE example. People want to fly. We see a surge of bookings whenever that's possible. I mean, this is for leisure travel and visiting friends and family. I think corporate travel is a little bit different. Although even for business travel, we think that we know there's value in face-to-face meetings. It might take longer to recover, but there will be some rise. It's probably too early to say whether there will be longer-term behavioural changes. Clearly, the length of this downturn and the length of time we've all spent on video calls will mean that clearly some of the trips will be substituted by video conferences, but there's, as I say, there's still sign of pent-up demand for leisure travel and a clear need for people to meet for business relationships and transferring knowledge.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. We have a question about vaccine delivery. Last year, there were some concerns that perhaps we wouldn't have the capacity available to efficiently and quickly distribute vaccines. The questioner asks if any of that has materialized, and then in general, how are airlines performing on vaccine rollout? Brian, maybe you have some thoughts on that, and I believe also Nick Kareen, our head of cargo for the moment, is also on the call. So maybe, Brian, do you want to start off and then see if Nick wants to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, the airlines have been very busy talking with all parts of the supply chain, mobilising capacity. This is the time of the year where the cargo capacity comes free. The end of last year, it was obviously the peak season where there was severe shortages because of other demands. Certainly in the industry figures, we see no signs of a problem there. But my colleague Nick Careen is the one that's been involved in the day-to-day discussions with the supply chain. He will probably have some more detail to add.
Yeah, I think perhaps Nick is disconnected for a bit. So, yes. So I think we'll leave it at that, and maybe if Nick joins later on, then we will we'll revert back on this question. Great. So next question would be also with respect to vaccines. Brian, you showed a chart that looked very much like there were differential rates of vaccine distribution in parts of the world. What are the implications to recovery for that?
Yes, I think this is the basis that we made our forecast in December, and I think it's still the case today. We expected that the advanced economies would have much fuller vaccination programs more rapidly, and that's proved to be the case. And that's partly because they have acquired a lot of the vaccine. I mean, one of the issues we were worried about earlier was that the Pfizer vaccine required very, very cold storage temperatures, which and the cold chain in emerging markets was not as developed. So the consequences are clearly going to be that it will take longer for the emerging markets to open their borders. I think it will take longer for Europe, North America to open their borders for inbound passengers from those markets. So we will see, I think, under any circumstances, a multi-speed recovery with certainly domestic markets recovering first, and then international markets between the advanced economies where vaccination has proceeded to the point where governments relax their travel restrictions to recover first. We're probably looking at 2022, 2023 for fuller recoveries across the world.
Okay. Alexandre, you talked about a potential or the need for governments to continue to provide financial support for the industry. If we are in a worst case scenario, as Brian highlighted, where we only see maybe 13% growth this year on last year's demand, do we have any idea as to how much money the industry will need in order to survive through the year?
The idea is an order of magnitude, and I refer to some of the estimates that Brian gave in terms of cash burn. We can expect that if governments would inject between $70 to $80 billion in 2021, that would allow the industry to bridge the gap. We hope. But the order of magnitude is around $70 to $80 billion. And again, I say it again, without using too much debt instruments, because the industry is too heavily indebted already.
Okay. Brian, we have a question for you about your 13% figure in the new variant scenario. Just asking for clarification, what would be the preconditions for that scenario to evolve?
Yes. So I stress this is a scenario at this stage. The primary driver is the new variants of the virus and the uncertainty about whether the vaccines that are being rolled out give sufficient protection against these variants. We should get more information on this as the various vaccines are tested against these new strains over the coming weeks. But I think the second driver of this variant scenario there's a recovery, but it's a much smaller recovery, is the behaviour of governments with regard to travel restrictions, because we had been basing our forecasts on governments being able and willing to start lowering travel restrictions once the vulnerable part of the population has been vaccinated. And I think what we've seen in recent weeks is governments taking a much, much tougher, more cautious approach. So it may depend on reaching herd immunity before travel restrictions are reduced, and it may be that herd immunity timeline has stretched out because of the new variant. So it's those two factors that will determine whether or not the risks are swinging inevitably towards that lower scenario, rather than the stronger recovery that we have based on a more successful outcome from vaccination and governments reducing travel restrictions to allow a summer season, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere.
Great, thanks, Brian. So again, just to emphasize, we're not changing our forecast for the year. We're only introducing this other potential scenario as something to watch. That's correct, Brian?
That's correct. Obviously a lot of moving parts at the moment, and it's that uncertainty about the second half which will become clearer over the next few weeks. But we're helping our member airlines and everybody else sort of understand the issues that we're facing by looking at this scenario. Should the variants prove more difficult to deal with, and should governments take a much more risk-averse approach to opening their borders.
Super, thank you, Brian. I see that Nick has joined us, so perhaps we'll go back to the question we had earlier on the distribution of vaccines and how the airlines are performing. In particular, have we seen any of the capacity shortages that we thought could happen or highlighted could potentially happen actually occur, and how are airlines performing in the distribution? Nick, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's been really no large amount of issues in terms of the logistics around transportation, most of which have been not air related but on the ground. There's been some challenges geographically in some places dealing with the logistics of ground movement, but from the aspects of cargo in the airlines, right now there has not been any major problems have been identified. We just issued the most recent guidance document. We keep on track of that. We are also keeping on track of any major incidents, and right now there hasn't been any, and hopefully that remains to be the case.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Nick. I have a question asking about the prognosis for long-haul services. In your scenarios, Brian, how do you see long-haul versus short-haul?
Taking longer to recover. I think we've seen that already, that domestic markets have more or less fully recovered in China and Russia, and it's taking much longer for travel restrictions to come down, really for the longer haul travel, particularly long haul travel with emerging markets. It's really the degree of vaccination, the trust governments have in the risk of importing coronavirus cases that is the determining factor. Some long haul markets we may see open up sooner, across the North Atlantic. That may be a market where we would see an earlier opening because the governments will be able to trust in the lower risk because of the vaccination and because of the innovations of things like travel pass that IATA are pushing.
Okay. Great, thanks very much, Brian. We have a question for you, Alexandre, and the question asks, is there any thought of holding a global air transport crisis summit where we would gather aviation, health, and government leaders to take a look at the current situation and I suppose do what we're doing on a country basis, but globally?
There is no project of that sort currently on a worldwide basis. We have on regional basis a regional group of airlines, government authorities, ourselves plus other industry organizations meeting regularly to analyze the situation, to propose new measures. That's true in Asia Pacific. We have a kind of crisis mode of organization on the Americas and even in Europe or Middle East. We do not see for the moment, government and the industry ready for a crisis summit. We think that it's more efficient to work, first of all, regionally, and secondly, on a worldwide basis through the international organizations such as IATA with the contribution of WHO and with the main governments involved in analyzing the situation and proposing or finding solutions. It's what we intend to do now with the third release of recommendation from what we call CART 3 that will be issued within the ICAO organization and under the ICAO umbrella to propose a new solution around partnership between states and the industry to restart air travel, particularly by developing roadmaps, vaccination requirements, sanitary passport or travel pass systems. So this type of recommendation that should be issued by the month of March. It will be the third recommendations, set of recommendations after CART 1 in May, CART 2 in November, and CART 3 that will be issued next March.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about the U.S. domestic market, and particularly some proposals to include testing as part of the requirement for flights within the United States. Nick, I know you were involved in some correspondence on that. Maybe you want to make some comments?
It's specifically to additional measures in the domestic space in the U.S. Is that what it is?
Correct. The requirement for testing for domestic flights in the U.S.
Yeah, there's been a lot of noise around the U.S. at the moment, primarily because, and I guess first and foremost, change in administration always results in a review of all existing processes, especially an emergency situation as it is today, and also the fact that the administration ran on the fact that they would review the country's response to COVID, and so travel is not immune to that, nor is many other things that are currently under review. We have not seen any move or suggestion that this is going to come to fruition. There is a review of this and others, but we have signed a letter in response to this with the newly appointed head of the COVID crisis group in the U.S., and we continue to look for an opportunity to have further discussion on it. So there's no answer as to which way a government will go or won't go, because my crystal ball no longer works. However, we are in discussions and involved with other associations and airline members to state our objection to that domestically.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. We have a question on cargo, and specifically, what's our outlook for cargo in 2020. Maybe Brian, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, good. I mean, that's the one bright spot in the industry. The world's economy needs air cargo to sustain its supply chains. Obviously, we need air cargo at the moment to distribute the vaccine, but I think often it's not appreciated that more than 1/3 of cross-border international trade, and much of that is in sort of vital components for many industries, takes place by air. So, whereas air travel was down by 2/3 last year, we saw cargo down by just a little bit under 11% in 2020. And by the end of the year, it was more or less where it was at the start of the previous year. And it could actually have been stronger, but for a shortage of capacity because of the grounding of the passenger fleet. Now, there's expected to be decent economic growth in 2021 that will fuel more demand. So, we're expecting probably double-figure growth in volumes for cargo. So that will be a welcome source of revenue. The challenge for the industry, for most airlines, is that it's too small a part of the business. I mean, in normal years, it's 12% of the airline's business, and that's too small to offset the still extraordinarily weak level of passenger revenues.
Thank you, Brian. We have a question asking about increasing restrictions on arrivals to the United States. And those restrictions have extended to a larger number of countries. Specifically, they're asking if we can quantify the impact that will have on the industry. Brian, maybe do you want to handle that?
I think we've already seen the impact that has. If you recall, I showed a slide where the UK removed the quarantine requirement on travel from the UAE, and we saw bookings rise, 100%, to levels which were higher than pre-COVID levels in just a matter of weeks. So, these travel restrictions do have a very substantial effect. There is pent-up demand, a willingness for many people to fly. So we've not got an estimate here of the impact of what's happening in the US. And I would say that just at this moment, this is typically a low season for air travel. The problem will be if this extends through to the Easter, and in particular for the summer months. The summer months are where airlines make most of their money, and it's if the restrictions extend through the summer months, then we really are talking about a situation getting even more serious than it is today.
Thanks, Brian. We have a question about vaccine certification. The questioner quotes the former head of WTTC as essentially saying that there's no prospect for any kind of global documentation around vaccination. I haven't seen the quote, so I don't think we can comment on the quote specifically, but Nick, I know through the Travel Pass, you're very involved in working with governments on the standards for vaccine certification. Maybe, do you want to expand on that, Nick?
Yeah, okay. There's two standards that we're looking at in terms of format and digitization, and that's around testing, and the other one's around vaccines. The testing process is being managed through CART, which Alexandre had referenced earlier, CART 3. They're also working in collaboration with the World Health Organization on the vaccine certificate as well. Both organizations are working on this. Timelines seem to be leading towards the middle of March. I'm not quite sure where that quote came from, but there are two organizations that are working on the standard. But aside from that, the systems that will be required to be in place to identify the current scenarios or situation the consumer may be in, whether that's testing or vaccines, we need to be able to adapt to a non-standard way as well, just like we do with paper today. So the digital, as you mentioned, the travel pass initiative will be able to accept the standard form when and if it comes, but is also geared towards the non-standard situation that we find ourselves in globally.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. We have a question about the difference in the potential for leisure and business travel development over the next period. Brian, do you see them developing in tandem, slightly different trajectories?
Very different, I think. We've seen there's a pent-up demand for leisure travel and for people visiting friends and family. That's clearly going to be what we will see recover first. I think business travel, well, we know business travel will be slow to recover. We speak to the corporate travel buyers and the travel management companies, and we know that large companies that generate typically a lot of business travel are being very cautious. They feel that there's a duty of care to their employees, and so I think doubts about risks will limit business travel, as well as the constraints on travel budgets that there are. So leisure and VFR travel will recover first, business last. But we do think that there will be a significant recovery of business travel in time, because we've seen the evidence of the value of those face-to-face meetings, and we certainly don't dismiss the need for businesses to send their people off to share knowledge and to strengthen business relationships.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. We have a question on slots, so maybe this one's for you, Alexandre. The questioner says, given the slow rebound in traffic, are we going to revisit the slot allocation policy in terms of pushing for extensions of existing holdings? I know there's been some movement on that. Maybe you want to update us, Alexandre?
No, what we are going to do is to ask for a waiver on the rule, the 80-20 use it or lose it rule, as we have done for the winter and the winter summer season, and again winter season 2021, and we will ask for a waiver for the winter season for the summer season 2021. And probably for the next one, the winter season 2021-2022. We have already obtained some waiver coming from various countries and continents. We are still waiting for the European decision for the summer season 2021.
Great, thanks very much, Alexandre. We have a very specific question with respect to Brazil and what are thoughts on the market development there. Brian, do you have anything specific on Brazil or Latin America?
Latin America has been really interesting. I think I showed earlier that we have seen international travel recovering actually much more in Latin America and South America than we have in many other regions, and that's again emphasised that it's travel restrictions that is the key factor here, because many governments replaced quarantine requirements with testing requirements, and that gave passengers the confidence and the freedom, and we saw stronger international travel. The Brazilian market has also been stronger than many other markets, not as strong as the Russian and the Chinese markets, but by the end of last year, by December, we saw passenger kilometres flown on that market up at a level 33% down on last year. So, relatively strong, certainly relative to the global average, and good load factors, actually. Load factors over 80% on that market.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. I have a question about the preparation that the industry needs for a restart. I don't think we've ever been in a situation like this, so no one has specific experience, but maybe Alexandre, from your experience at running Air France KLM, how much time do you think it will require in order to prepare the processes, rehiring crews, maintenance, all of those types of issues? How long do you think the industry needs for a ramp up?
That's a difficult question because it depends on the speed and the slope of the ramp up. I think that the industry is probably ready to come back pretty quickly to 50% of its capacity, very quickly, instead of being around 35-38%. And probably until 60%. After, it will take some months to rehire, to recertify, or to update, the license of technical people, pilots, mechanics, cabin crew. So to come back to the full capacity could take 1 year, 1 year and a half. But if it's that the challenge, we would be so happy. Come back to full capacity.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. We have another question just on the idea of testing in the domestic markets, asking us if we're aware of any countries where testing for domestic travel is required.
Well, the immediate one that comes to mind is what's being done in China. That they do it there. But they do some more severe things too in terms of complete shutdowns of locations for entry in and out. So that's probably the only real example that comes to mind right now in terms of policy around domestic testing at the moment. We do have a database which would indicate that. So we're happy, Tony, if you took the questioner's name and we could provide the information that we're tracking in the database. Yep,
great. Thanks very much. It was an anonymous question, but if people want to write to us, we'll be sure to get back to them. We have another question, I think for you, Alexandre. The question says, with the amount of government money that's coming into the industry, are we concerned that there could be a swing back towards protectionism as governments seek to protect their investments, or perhaps changes to open skies, liberalization, all of those types of issues? Alexandre, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, we have thoughts. It's clearly a concern that the comeback of governments in the financing of the airlines, in the shareholding of the airlines, or in regulating, their frontiers and the access to their territory could lead to an additional, let's say, protectionism, interventionism of states. It's clearly a concern, and that's the reason why when we have worked on recommendations issued by international organizations such as ICAO through CART 1 or CART 2 or CART 3, when we have asked for government support, we have always said that it had to be temporary, and that we should go back to normal with the open skies, with a lot of competition, no protectionism, as fast as possible.
Okay, thanks, Alexandre. We have a question on the cost of travel. Do we have any projections on how the industry will deal with, I suppose, the need on the one hand to have prices that will attract travelers, and on the other hand, generate the revenue needed to cover costs?
Yes, I mean, what we're seeing at the moment is, airlines are pricing low to try to attract passengers onto seats. If you look at the yields that have been reported by the European airlines recently, they're all down significantly, as they are in the US. So this is a real challenge to restore profitability or to stop burning through cash, which is the immediate challenge at the moment. And really the only solution, in the absence obviously of direct government aid, is to downsize costs. And this requires the cooperation of the whole of the supply chain as well, in order to help shrink the air transport cost base to fit the much smaller flow of revenues that are being generated at the moment.
Great, thanks, Brian. We're just about at the top of the hour, so we'll take just one last question. This question is about a situation in Hong Kong, but probably has implications more broadly with respect to the testing of crew, and whether or not some of the proposals there have actually come to fruition, and if we are seeing carriers being impacted by the fact that crew are being required to quarantine. Maybe Nick, are you up on that issue?
Yeah, and more broadly, I mean, we've been that's again also another specific item within the CART 3 process to get a little bit more finer in terms of our positions on exempting crews from requirements of quarantine and testing. And Hong Kong has been an example where we've been having issues with them for months on this particular topic. We had seen some companies make changes to their schedule as a result of it, and others that have been adjusting to deal with it, and no large amount of media attention in terms of impact, other than I think KLM was probably one of the examples that cited it as a rationale for for cancelling some flights there, and others as well. But by and large, it's our position is that crews are to be exempt. The majority of countries in the world are following that. Most recently, even in the US, as they readjusted their policies, and Canada, who's gotten even more restrictive, have allowed for those alleviations to be in place, and those waivers to be in place. And we continue to have those discussions with countries that do not follow that process, and again, utilizing ICAO to also reaffirm our position and make sure that there's consistency globally in that approach.
Great, thanks, Nick. And I guess just to be clear, we understand there's been no decision made in Hong Kong. That's correct?
Not at the moment. It's been a gesticulation, I guess, more than anything. But it's been on the books for quite some time.
Yeah, indeed. Super. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I think that